For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ned Bowman. I am the outreach coordinator at Great Basin Bird Observatory here in Reno, Nevada. We are a small nonprofit research organization, and we do a lot of data collection throughout Nevada, Arizona, surrounding areas in the Great Basin. And this event tonight is part of our outreach program. So before I hand it over to Joel, who is going to be featured tonight, I just want to talk about a few upcoming events with Great Basin Bird Observatory here. It is a very busy time of year, and it seems very hectic, but next Wednesday, I'm doing an earbirding walk at Davis Creek Regional Park. We have a community science Pinyon Jay training event in Elko on the 18th of August. The Intermountain West Shorebird surveys are happening from August 9th through August 22nd, and I will be representing GBBO surveying Pyramid Lake, and I think a number of folks in attendance tonight are aware of this and are participating in other counts. So it's a cool community science project, really in theme with tonight's presentation. And then into September, we have a few more bird walks on the 15th and on the 22nd. You can find information about that on our website on the upcoming events tab. On the 22nd and 23rd of September, we're doing a bird banding workshop. And you can find more info about all of those on our website, on our social medias at Facebook and Instagram. We are Great Basin Bird Observatory on there. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Joel Geier, who is our regional Christmas bird count compiler for Oregon and Nevada. And I flipped through his slides and it should be pretty neat. So I'm excited to hear what he's got to say. So I'm going to shut up and hide my video and let Joel take it away.
All right, thanks a lot, Ned. Yeah, and thanks to everybody that's joining this. I'm going to try to wrestle with the screen sharing here, but get my first slide up here. So yeah, thanks for the nice introduction, and thank you to everyone for showing up. And I'm gonna let me just get, it's always the awkward part, getting things going here. Okay, yeah, Ned and I thought it might be nice to have something to talk about more winter-like in this time of the year when we're all sort of baking. I'll be talking about the Christmas bird counts in the Great Basin, and particularly I'll talk about the Northern Great Basin region. I might sometimes refer to the Christmas bird count as a CBC jargon that we use, not to be confused with the Canadian Broadcasting Company, which I grew up listening to in northern Minnesota, and you might pick up my accent there. I've been volunteering on the CBCs in the region for about 25 years, starting off as a volunteer field counter, and then as a compiler for a few small counts. And just lately, within the last 5 or 6 years, I've taken on the role first of being the regional editor for Oregon and the regional editor for Nevada. That last one started as an interim thing at first, but I kind of like doing it. It is basically just checking all the boxes and making sure the data are in good shape that go into the National Audubon database. But mainly I'm here because I think these counts are a whole lot of fun, and I also think they're really valuable as information about wintering bird populations and habitat use in what can be some very harsh environments, but interesting environments. But before I go into what we get out of these things, I thought it'd be good to give some background on the origin of Christmas bird counts. This is the old story you might have heard. There's a typo here. It's the 1800s, not the 1880s. There was a tradition apparently called the Christmas side hunt, which involved people going out after or before dinner, I forget which, but basically they would just try to shoot everything that moved, whether it had fur or feathers, and then they would haul it all back and compare their bag for the day, and whoever had the most dead things won, apparently. As an ornithologist at that time, Frank Chapman had the idea to start a new tradition that would be a little less lethal for our feathered friends. So on Christmas Day in 1900, he managed to organize 25 counts that drew 27 birders, so basically one birder per count, except a couple may have had two. And they were spread out across the country, but mainly in the Northeast. The closest ones to our region were in coastal California, and there was one somewhere in Colorado. but there were no counts in the Great Basin region for several decades. And if you haven't done a Christmas count, or you haven't ever organized one or thought about organizing one, basically it starts off with some local organizers who want to have a count, and they end up picking a count circle. In the upper right hand corner of your screen, you'll see the circle that I picked for Sheldon, Nevada, with consulting with a few other people. But whether it's good or bad, basically our main issue there was choosing a place that we thought would have good road access in the winter. All of these circles, one thing they have in common, they're all supposed to be 15 miles in diameter, and they're not supposed to overlap with other active CBC circles. And then someone volunteers to be a compiler. On a lot of our counts in the region, they're small counts with just a few volunteers, so it's usually just one person that's the compiler. On some of the bigger counts, and especially some big cities, they might have multiple co-compilers who help organizing different parts of the circle and with some of the logistics and getting permission and all those sorts of things. But in most of our counts in the region, where these are one person shows, then you pick a count day, and it has to be somewhere between December 14th and January 5th. And on that day, everyone gets together, they go out and look for birds in their assigned areas or sectors. We have some counts where it's just one person trying to cover out as much as they can, but usually you have hopefully at least 10, 20, or even 30 people, and you can divide up into teams and cover the area, just parts of the area in each team. And a little bit of the jargon there is some places refer to that as sectors, others refer to it as count areas or count zones. And yeah, usually you're working in teams. And then another bit of jargon, parties. This is one of the terms that causes the most confusion when the CBC organizers use it. But it's really, if you think of hunting parties, this is a throwback to the old pre-Christmas bird count side hunt. There's some of the heritage showing through there, and we still call them parties today. But a more sensible way to think of it is as teams. And then on most counts, everyone tries to get together at the end of the day. At least before COVID came along, we would all get together for a countdown in various places, either a restaurant, someone's home, or on some of our refuges, they actually have bunkhouses where we get to stay. And everybody goes through the numbers. If you found something weird, something like you might have a list like that right there. And if you found something unusual, you try to figure out if you have enough details to support it in the database. And then everyone goes home, and the compiler after that works on the data, gets everything together, and sends it into the central database that's run by National Audubon Society. So that's been how it's worked for about 100 years now. And it's gotten to be counts. There are now thousands of these counts. I think there's over 2,500 counts altogether that were completed in the current year. And this is just a map of the ones that are in the United States and bordering parts of Canada and a little bit in northern Mexico. In some areas, the total number of birds is 40 million. Big question is always, did we count robins twice in multiple circles? And no doubt that happens, especially if you look in the northeastern United States, or even some places where I live in Western Oregon in the Willamette Valley, the count circles practically overlap with each other. It's actually hard to put a new circle in without having more bumping into somebody else's count. So there probably is some overlap in coverage in terms of birds flying between circles, but the idea is the circles shouldn't overlap. And yeah, before I go further, I should just say, if anyone wants to jump in with questions, I probably won't really be watching the hand raising thing, but if somebody can let me know if there's a question, I can stop at any point if you want to ask about something. So yeah, the idea has even gotten beyond the US and Canada. There are now counts down all the way through Mexico, down through Central America, even as far south in Central America as in South America as Peru and Brazil. I did hear there was one Antarctica count once, I think when Noah Stricker was down there, but I'm not sure if that one still goes every year. And then there are some islands in the Caribbean and out in the Pacific. It still looks a little bit like the Monroe Doctrine at work. I don't think there's any counts in Europe or in Asia yet, but basically within the old American sphere of influence in North and South. But here where we are, or where you are, some of you are, I'm back in the wet side of Oregon, but out in the Great Basin, counts are really few and far between. This happens to be a sage grouse. I think back in 2014, we had finished the count. We went a little bit outside the circle, and there we found this bird just outside the circle, so we couldn't count him. And unfortunately, the sage grouse there do like to hang out just outside the circle in winter. But there's a whole lot of territory like that in the Great Basin. Before I get into the details of where those counts are, I just wanted to say a little bit about the Great Basin. People have different ideas of what it is. There's a hydrological Great Basin, and that's basically the area where water doesn't get out, surface water doesn't get out. So any river that's inside this basin, it's going to end up flowing either to what's called a terminal lake, like the Great Salt Lake or Pyramid Lake, or up in Oregon, there's Lake Ebert, a couple smaller ones, Goose Lake, or it's going to go to a sink, such as the Carson Sink. The basin actually extends farther south into the Mojave, and way down south, it gets into a bit of the Sonoran Desert. But here I'm going to focus mostly on the northern part of the region. And in particular, I'll talk about the northern Great Basin, what's called the Great Basin Desert. This is mainly in Nevada, a little bit in Utah, and a little bit into Idaho, and just bits of Oregon, where rainfall is less than 10 inches per year. I should say total precipitation, because one key characteristic is that most of the precipitation comes as snowfall that melts in the summer. So snow in the high mountains that melts and runs down into these basins. So we'll leave out the Mojave, but I will talk about some counts that go up into the Great Basin part of Oregon, which gets a little bit more rainfall, up to 15 inches of rain in some areas. And it still has basically a dominant sagebrush habitat. Oh yeah, sorry, I was going to say also, so here the basin really is formed by the rain shadow of the Sierra Nevada. I'm trying to keep those straight here, Nevada and Nevada, but I think the mountains are Nevada. And Reno and Sparks and Carson City are right on the edge of that, getting the water that flows out of there that makes it possible to farm in the area. And then on the other side of the basin, over by the Wasatch Front, which actually gets some climate influence coming out even on the Gulf of Mexico sometimes, we have Salt Lake City, Ogden, basically where the Latter-day Saints set up their colony early on. But in between there's an area with really, it's one of the least populated areas in the lower 48. If you look at the maps of satellite views of the United States at night, this is the big black area, black hole in the whole map. And because there are not many people in that area, it's not surprising that CBCs have been rather slow to get established out in there. In fact, as of 1936, so this is 36 years into the history of Christmas bird count, there still wasn't a Christmas bird count in the basin and range, either hydrologically or in terms of the Great Basin Desert. The nearest one would really be the Klamath Falls one, which you can see over on the left side of the screen, just above the California-Oregon border. And Klamath Falls is in the Basin and Range Geological Province, and it has some species like juniper titmouse comes right to the edge of its range. So in terms of the ecosystem, it's sort of the edge of what we think of as a Great Basin type ecosystem, but still not really in the basin. But that was the only one that has any data for this area prior to the 1940s. In 1940, there were 3 counts that popped up. One is at Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, which got to be a little famous a couple of years ago. And then the Ruby Lake Refuge in northeastern Nevada also started a count. Both of these are national wildlife refuges, and the counts were sponsored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There was another one in the town of Nixon, Nevada, up by Pyramid Lake, that was, I'm not sure who sponsored that, but it only lasted for 1 year. You see the year 1940, this is right before World War II, and a lot of things went on ice as soon as the war started, and the Nixon Christmas bird count didn't survive. but there are some other um, counts that started to pop up in the region in the 1950s. So by the 1953, this is the Unionville count. I hadn't even thought of this town. I've driven probably past it on Highway 80, but it's a little bit south of Winnemucca, not far from Rye Patch Reservoir, but just off on a side valley. And that one also was a short-lived count, really covering some areas with irrigated crop circles, so it got some agricultural birds. But it was really the only one in the region other than the older two counts until California started to get on the action. First with the Woodbridges count, I think is, I can't read the top of the screen. This yeah, I was blanking on the name of this one. It's Wood something. So out of my region, so I don't worry about it that much. But also, Truckee Meadows got started at this time by the mid 1960s. And Truckee Meadows is really the Reno count. There was an earlier Reno count that went for a few years, but they shifted the count circle a little bit to make it more practical, I guess. And then there was also, yeah, the Unionville count was still going, but so far that was it until the 1970s, when first up in Oregon, the Heart Mountain count got going. This was launched by a group from Reed College in Portland, students and professors who wanted to study the birds out there. So they would drive everywhere, all the way from Portland. It's quite a long drive in the winter, go out there, count birds. And also south of there, all along the edge of the Sierras, there's several more counts that popped up in California. There's the Honey Lake count north of Reno. And I think it's the Mono, there's the Mammoth Lakes count was the next one. The Mono Lake count came later. And also Utah starts to get in the action over by Salt Lake City. You see the blue circles up there, and the Bear, it's a Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge on the northeast side of Salt Lake. So those are the earliest data really from the east side of the Great Basin. 1985, things started to fill in, especially again more in California. There now Mono Lake has a count, and there's a Bishop count, which is sort of down at the south edge of the region I'll be talking about here. And there was a Crescent Canyon site. I forget the name of all this. There's one down in southern Utah. There's another one, Crescent Canyon, I think, and then a couple more on the Wasatch Front. There's an Evanston count in Wyoming, which is not quite it's in the Great Basin hydrologically, but it's really out of the Great Basin desert region. And then let's see, there was a count also near, someone started a count circle near Ely. It's not the new Ely circle, which came along later. This one only ran for a few years. And then there was also a count at the Fish Springs National Wildlife Refuge out on the south side of the Great Salt Desert. And yeah, and also, yeah, there's another sod house count started up just on the north end of Malheur Refuge. So Malheur Refuge had two counts at that point. And I think I skipped over the 1990s. More of the same, except Fallen gets going, and also Pyramid Lake gets going. Those are now very active counts in Nevada. Elko gets involved, and a couple more counts along the Wasatch Front in Utah, and there's the Summer Lake count starts up really at the northwestern corner of the Oregon part of the Great Basin. And the Reedies, as we call the Reed College people, they also started an Adel count in Adel, Oregon, a little south of Heart Mountain. There's a gas station of maybe about 20 houses there. And Burns comes online as really the northern edge of the Great Basin, and that's a town-centered count by 2000. And down in south of Fallen, also the Walker Lake, I think it was called the Walker Lake Interpretive Society, started a count there at Walker Lake that ran also for just a few years. 2010, there start to be these counts in right along the Idaho, Nevada, and Idaho, Utah border. There's a Jarbidge count that usually it's pretty hard to get in there, except if you come from the Idaho side. And then a couple of counts There's the um, sagebrush. Yes, blanking on the names. I had them all in my mind. There's a couple more counts in the southern edge of Idaho, just north of Utah. I think this is getting to Cassiar Crossbill territory. And then also way over in the edge, there's a Bear Lake count. And I think that's most of them. There's a Sierra Valley count that also got started. And a South Lake Tahoe count, which again is getting a little bit out of it's out of the Great Basin Desert, but still in the region hydrologically. And then finally, around 2020, we started to fill in a couple of the big holes with Sheldon count, which I've been involved in, the Winnemucca count, which I like to try to get to when I can. And I'll probably say this wrong, but down in the south end, the southern Pahranagat Valley, which pokes a little bit into the southern edge of the Great Basin region, down not far north in Las Vegas. And that brings us right up to 2022. We've got more circles in the area now than we ever had, but there's also some ghost circles. You can see there's, I left them in here as really faint circles on the map. These are from counts that were abandoned. The kind of the main ones are the Unionville count, a little south of Winnemucca, the Walker Lake count, and Adel, which had to be abandoned because of access issues eventually. Some of the other counts that have been discontinued, like Nixon and the Stillwater Refuge, are reasonably well represented by nearby counts. The Nixon one is really close to the current Pyramid Lake count, and the Stillwater one is fairly close to Fallen. But these other ones are sort of existing gaps. If anyone ever wanted to start a new count in Nevada, these would be ideas on places where I would think about just to have that long-term record. But overall, even with these other the counts that are still going, there are some big holes on the map. And one reason for the gaps is that the region is often perceived as birdless, quote, birdless by birders who would rather see lots of birds and lots of species in a single day. But I don't know, I think it's a pretty interesting place. It's especially an interesting place to look at changes in winter bird distribution in times when we're having climate change. As I mentioned, the Great Basin Desert is unique in North America, or at least south of the Arctic, as a cold desert that receives most of its precipitation as snow in the winter months. And the birds that do winter there can be very sensitive to snow cover, as well, and especially availability of open water. So as the climate fluctuates and we get more wild swings, we've seen more swings due to these causes in particular. There's also some birds that are really dependent on some of the major trees of the region. In the northern part of the region, they can rob open flocks of thousands and solitaires in flocks of many hundreds where you have a good western juniper break crop. Okay, I think I'm going to shut off my video to save on bandwidth here. And then farther south, the pinyon pines are another important tree. And where there are water bodies, freshwater, especially like Ruby Lake, Malheur Refuge, and then Summer Lake, which is partly alkaline but has some freshwater areas. These are significant wintering areas for trumpeter swans and quite a few other waterfowl. The last few years until this one left entire lake beds dry due to drought. And this really, what we saw was this really affected waterfowl, but also semi-hardy songbirds like sparrows that we usually find around small seeps and edges of open water. So all these things are things that, as the climate is changing, this is a region that probably is especially sensitive to some of these effects. And that is one reason to be interested. See? Okay, sorry. I grabbed the wrong mouse here. One of the things that does get people interested in some of these remote counts, especially people coming from south of Nevada, is that it does tend to get, this region does tend to get northern wanderers. There was a fellow by the name of Jack Walters, who used to go birding quite a bit. I used to hear from every year he'd go up to the northern edge of Nevada, hoping to see what he called northern wonders or Arctic wonders. But these are birds that just occasionally they might come more often to Oregon, but they may rather rarely stray into northern Nevada. And particularly like this year, we had a nice flock of Bohemian waxwings in Winnemucca that Roy Morris managed to get a photo here. Joe Tuvell was also trying to get photos of them. I think we had 17. And the year before, there was a big eruption of common red poles. We wound up with 30 at Sheldon Refuge. Unfortunately, I don't think many of them made it farther south, but they also had a big influx in Klamath Falls, and we even had a couple up on Hart Mountain. American tree sparrows are one of the more regular ones to show up in sort of along the northern edge of Nevada and southern edge of Oregon. Sheldon has been a good place for this. Also, the elko count tends to get these. And let's see, last year, really exciting bird for people who managed to get out there to see it at Pyramid Lake was this gerfalcon. I'm not actually sure. I think Ben Sonnenberg was the one who found it. Dennis Sertahaley sent me these as a video captures. I'm not actually sure who the video capture comes from, so I might not have the right name on this, but it was pretty spectacular bird, viewed at very long range through a scope, but always really cool to see. And I think if I remember right, they had all 5 of the normal North American falcons or north of the border falcons. So they had a peregrine, prairie falcon, which is fairly normal, Merlin, and American kestrel, plus a gyre. And a little bit less dramatic, but also fairly reliable up in the northern tier is northern shrikes. Here we have this is a juvenile northern shrike, but usually we get three or 4 of them in the Sheldon area, and occasionally they wander a little farther south into some of the more southern counts. So those are one reason to get at least out of Reno. But then just in general, there's some interesting things happening in the range that maybe won't draw people out to get checks on their list, but they're interesting to watch. Anna's hummingbird is one of these species that has been spreading north and eastward out of originally, I think when 30 years ago, it was almost entirely in California. And then it managed to get into Western Oregon, and it spilled over the Cascades into Eastern Oregon in recent years. And it's also made its way up into southeastern California and starting to show up in the Reno area too. Even red-shouldered hawk is kind of in the same category. It's been spreading out of what used to be more of a California-centered range and showing up more and more. And I mentioned, see, both of these species have shown up even in elko in the last year. And then Say's Phoebe has been around. It's always around in the summer in the region, but we're seeing more of these birds wintering northward into the Great Basin. So as conditions are getting milder, they're able to winter farther north. As insectivores, they have to be able to find bugs, and the conditions apparently have gotten to the point where they can do this more often. And another flycatcher, the black phoebe, is also moving northward and eastward out of Oregon. One guy coming the other way is a blue jay coming out of Idaho and showing up in northeastern Oregon. Last year, 2 years ago, we had one at Hart Mountain that made it all the way there. And then really surprising was a couple of barred owls. There was one that was recorded in the Malheur refuge count in 2019. And the same year, another one showed up at Hart Mountain. Unfortunately, it was really hard pressed for food and was grappling with a red-tailed hawk in broad daylight, fighting over some kind of prey, and it lost the battle apparently, and probably didn't survive past that. But then I think last year there was also one at Hot Spring, just north of Gerlach. So they're starting to show up at odd places in the region and might be seen more in the future as part of their general spread into the Pacific Northwest. A couple of real exciting birds from last winter. Out at Fallen, there's turkey vulture, another sign of things being a little bit milder, in these birds being able to survive and find soaring thermals far enough north to last through part of the winter at least. The red-shouldered hawk and elko that I mentioned. And also out at Fallon, there's this lesser yellowlegs. There are actually, I think, about a dozen of them, if I recall correctly. This happened to be a really cool photo in flight. They also got some photos of them side by side with greater yellowlegs, which are always nice to see. And out at Pyramid Lake, there was this burrowing owl. You might have a hard time spotting it. I don't know how the observers managed to spot this bird. I've already zoomed this in from a long range scope picture. So this was some good spotting there of a very cryptic bird. And down in Truckee Meadows, around Reno has been a very good gull spot. Couple places around town that tend to draw big gull flocks. And for I think both of the last 2 years, they've had lesser blackbed gulls show up there, and lots of others. For gull watchers, there's a lot of challenges there. Some more surprising birds. Henderson's not really in the Great Basin. I cheated here and included this one because it was one of the more exciting birds last winter, but it's a female summer tanager that was found in Henderson. And a vermilion flycatcher. I think this was only the second record for Fallon, getting also pretty far north for a flycatcher. And also at the same place, there was a swamp sparrow sneaking around in the swamp as you'd expect. And really surprising was an eastern phoebe up at Truckee Meadows. Some great photos by Brendan Lucy here. Interestingly, there were also a couple of eastern phoebes in Northeast Oregon last year, a little bit north of the Great Basin region, but something seems to be going on with this species also, showing up more in our region in the winter, moving east out of its range in that case. But beyond the kind of just fun birds and exciting birds and rarities, there's some general scientific and conservation benefits of the Christmas bird count. And kind of the main strong point it has is its longevity. There are now 3 counts that are over 80 years in terms of span of records in the region, if we count Klamath Falls as well as Malheur and Ruby Lake. And there are another 7 that have more than 50 years worth of records, and a dozen with more than 35 years of data. So this is about, at least 10 of these were started before even before the breeding bird survey, and all of them were started basically before eBird became a major thing. Traditions have kind of varied. They definitely vary between counts. If you go from one circle to another, you might find that the compiler has a very different style of covering the circle. But one strong point of the Christmas bird count is that within a given circle, usually compilers tend to stick to the same approach. They usually stay on the job for a while. And so older counts tend to have established traditions over a period often up to decades. So that means that the data are at least somewhat comparable over a long span of time within a given count. As I mentioned, the breeding bird survey, which I also really strongly support, it's a breeding happens in May and June. And this is set up according to more rigorous statistical protocols that were designed for really number crunching, but it didn't really start until 1966, and routes in the Great Basin, really most of them didn't start until even later. So there's the track record for that is relatively short. There have been comparisons made, and it seems that populations as measured by the breeding bird survey since then tend to track more or less with populations that are tracked over a longer period of time by the Christmas bird count. But this leaves the Christmas bird count really is unique as a survey of wintering bird populations. And especially as we're coming into a time, or already deeply into a time of climate change that we're all kind of suffering from this summer again, the long-term shifts in their wintering ranges may show responsive birds to that effect. And that's something that, since the Christmas bird count has been around for really a long time in a lot of places, it's something that we can really make use of. So I'll just give a few examples of some specific species that have been tracked over this period of time. So I wouldn't say it's really an 80-year record for pinion jays, but pinion jays are a species of concern. Those early count circles that I mentioned at Malheur, Ruby Lake, and Klamath Falls aren't really in the right habitat for pinion jays for the most part. So really significant data start up in the late 1960s. And I'll have a series of these plots, and all of them I have basically it's the number of birds as a function of the year. So as on the bottom axis, we have the year starting in 1940 going up to 2020, which was the first COVID year. I cut that out because there's some blips on that because of COVID effects. And generally I have different colors here for different states. So California is the golden state. Anything that looks kind of gold is California. I think I used sort of purplish and maroon for Nevada, reddish, a little more reddish shade for Oregon, and over by Utah and Idaho, it starts to get more bluish shades of purple. And then as you go north within any state, the colors get fainter or paler. So farther north is paler, so think of more snowy and fewer birds. Anyway, it's pretty hard to make sense out of this plot with everything plotted on top of each other. So I wanted to break it out in terms of eastern and western Great Basin. So here, this is just the counts that are in the eastern Great Basin. You'll notice it's all purple and blue now. So this is Idaho, eastern Nevada, over by Ely and Elko, Ruby Lake, Snake Valley, and then Utah. And kind of what you see with pinyon jays, no big surprise. They tend to winter in big flocks, and if you catch a big flock, you get a high count. If you don't catch one, you get a lower count. So the numbers really bounce all over the place from year to year. But overall, it looks like the trend is fairly stable. There might be a few of these counts where there seems to be a decline over time, but it'd be hard to say that there's a real declining trend in the eastern part of the range based on what Christmas bird count data are showing. In the western part of the range, again, it's really spiky, and there's been some really big spikes. I think these were from Carson City, if I remember right, has had the really big spikes in recent years. But especially down in the California part of the northern Great Basin, there are just fewer of these higher number counts as we've gotten farther along in time. So there could be an argument here that numbers have been declining especially in the western part of the region, and then that this shows up in the Christmas bird counts. Another species that lots of people worry about is greater sage grouse. When all these counts started, they just called them sage grouse, and now they're greater sage grouse because of the split with Gunnison, which is even more trouble. Some of the early counts were established on refuges where they would make a point of going out to count sage grouse, and they probably knew where some of them were. But really the big numbers that we see are in the Wyoming count, this Evanston, Wyoming count, which I mentioned. That's sort of there in pale blue on this plot. And that was started up only in the 1980s. And also there were a few of those counts up in southern Idaho that started around the same time. So really there wasn't that much of a record until you get into the 1980s. But since that time, you can see that really the big numbers are all in that eastern part of the Great Basin and into Idaho. And there have been very few instances where more than counts elsewhere have had more than about 10 birds, usually only a handful. If we set aside the Idaho and Wyoming data and just look at the data from the other three states, California, Nevada, and Oregon, and a little bit of Utah, you can see this a little bit better. There was an early count, I think, at Ruby Lake that had over 200 sage grouse. And then at Hart Mountain, one of the first years, they had also a huge count there. Kind of this, the skinny on that is that they actually had some radio track birds, so they used them as sort of Judas grouse to kind of find where the whole flock was, and then they could count the whole flock. So that really represents tactics that we're not able to use most of the time now. But overall, there were some higher counts in other places in the 1980s and 1990s, but those higher counts have gotten fewer and farther in between. Really, the one exception is there's the Mammoth Lakes count down in California, and Jarbidge right on, also on the Idaho border, has had some. It's in Nevada, but on the Idaho border has had some relatively high counts. Otherwise, um, fairly small. On a more positive thing, in terms of, it's always nicer to talk about bird numbers increasing rather than decreasing, but here's the situation with Say's phoebes. We really see the effect here of the expansion, especially in the southeastern California, down by Bishop. There's been, excuse me, I need to cough here. So down by Bishop, there's these. This has become a species now found in pretty substantial numbers every year. I better have some water. One of the other after effects of COVID is I've had this dry cough ever since that. So, and also, sorry, everybody. See if I can get my if I can get my voice back here. If anybody has some questions, this might be a good time to chime in. Usually goes after a minute. So okay, try not to cough in the microphone. But besides what's going on in Bishop, you can see there's been just more tendency to have more birds show up in farther northern counts. So some of these birds are even showing up into northeastern Oregon now in recent years. So this is probably a case where generally milder conditions, a lot of winters with not much snow cover, has made it easier for Say's phoebes to winter farther north and not retreat as far into their southern part of the range as they normally would. A related species, but sort of a different phenomenon going on here, is the black phoebes. As I mentioned, these are expanding basically out of California. Prior to 1980, there were really practically none of them being found in anywhere in the region. A couple of little blips here and there, but these are also now a very common species down in Bishop, and increasingly they're starting to show up in more modest numbers up into the Reno area and even some of the more northern counts in the Great Basin. And that's probably a trend that we'll see continuing. We're also seeing them showing up more regularly in Klamath Falls too, and that's become another source of these birds moving out eastward into the Great Basin region. Kind of birds moving in the same direction. Red-shouldered hawks are a similar phenomenon. Very few until about 1980s, then just a few here and there. But again, these have really gone up in numbers in Bishop, and they've also become a regular presence around the Reno, Carson City area and around Klamath Falls. And they're starting to show up even farther inland now in the Oregon part of the Great Basin. And as I mentioned, this year the Elko count had its first one, and also Ruby Lake had one. With those birds, and I don't know if the jury is still a little bit out, but we should maybe also be thinking about possibility of expansion from the eastern part of the range. So most of the birds that have been seen so far from the western subspecies, and that's also true even of birds that have shown up in northeastern Oregon close to the Idaho state line. But there is a chance that some of these more eastern birds being seen over in Utah and out in eastern Nevada could also come from the eastern subspecies. So something for the experts to try to tell apart. And one species there's really no doubt about is wild turkeys. They've really skyrocketed since in lots of parts of Oregon, in Utah, Idaho, lots of places since, especially since the around the year 2000. We know that there have been a lot of introductions by state wildlife agencies that no doubt are a big part of this reason, this expansion, but also climate may be a factor. Turkeys need to be able to scratch, and if there's deep snow, they might have more trouble finding food, might be more restricted to smaller areas, and they might have more winter mortality if it gets really cold. So as the climate changes, that could also be favoring expansion of these introduced birds in the region. Usually at some point, especially recently, as eBird's gotten more popular and Christmas bird count still chugging along, there's sometimes a question of what's the relationship between these two, and are Christmas bird counts really necessary, or can eBird replace them, or do they work together? If you like to do eBird, can you participate in a Christmas bird count and use your eBird apps? And the answer is that for the most part, the data protocols used in eBird can be accommodated within the Christmas bird count protocol. A lot of times eBird is calling for more detailed data and more detailed protocols than the Christmas bird count, where things tend to get lumped into the whole circle count. So there's not much problem in going that direction. There's also been a lot of recent efforts to interface the eBird app to Christmas bird count compiling tools. In some cases, you can even set up a group within eBird that just automatically adds up all the data and sends a list to the compiler. And I think there's a few counts where they're entirely using eBird now, or asking people to do that. But there are still lots of counts that are using old paper forms or various spreadsheets or whatever, because, well, as I mentioned, each count has its own tradition. One thing that, from my position as a reviewer, is that the tools that are available in eBird, and especially the Macaulay library, have really made it easier to document rarities. There are a lot of people that send in the rare bird forms every year, and I really appreciate the effort that goes into those. But when in cases where someone's actually made the effort to document a bird on eBird to try to convince the eBird local reviewers that it was a good sighting, and especially where they have photos, sound clips, and good descriptions there, it's kind of redundant sometimes to even go through the Christmas bird count reporting. So I've been asking people just to, if they have something that's been documented in eBird, to just send me the link to that documentation, and then I can take it from there. But really having those tools available has made it much easier to document a lot of these, and certainly a lot fewer birds are going through the cracks. But it also works the other way. There's feedback from the Christmas bird count to eBirds. And the biggest thing is just that the Christmas bird counts they're partly a social event, and they are a way that birders get drawn out to less populated parts of the Great Basin where they might never think about going otherwise. Compilers are busy drumming up volunteers, and volunteers like to go back to these places year after year often. And as they come out to those places, they increasingly are tending to record their sightings as eBird. And that's both during the Christmas bird count, as I mentioned, and then often also while traveling between counts or while scouting the circle. So in large parts of the Great Basin, it turns out that often the only winter reports on eBird come from Christmas bird count volunteers. This is a map showing this from last winter. Here I've got the purple dots on here are the Christmas bird counts that happened in December of 2022 through January of 2023. And then the gray shaded rectangles are the areas where there were any eBird data at all. So in other words, outside of the shaded rectangles, there was not even a single report on eBird from those months, not even a house sparrow or a pigeon. So what you can see is that most of the places where there were data in eBird from these last winter's Christmas bird count season, almost in most cases that's places where there were Christmas bird counts that were actually happening right there or right next to the place. And then there were also a few sightings along the highways that people would take to get between counts, and along Interstate 80 and US 95 and so on. And I think in Plush, we picked up a mockingbird one of those years too, just from people that happen to be on the way to Heart Mountain. They stopped for gas and they found a mockingbird that went into eBird but didn't go into our count circle. So there's really a good feedback loop. If we didn't have these Christmas bird counts happening out in these areas, it's a little questionable about whether we'd get anything on eBird without some other way to motivate people to get out there. So that's all good. But looking back at our Christmas bird count map, as I mentioned, there's still some big gaps. This was the situation in 2013, which I called the Great Black Hole of the Great Basin. There was really two of them. One is in the Northern Great Basin, one's in the a little farther south. And as of 2013, this is before the Winnemucca and Sheldon refuge counts got going, and also the Southern Pahranagat Valley hadn't gotten going yet. So there's a couple little points of light in those big black holes, but otherwise, those, as you can see, compared to the areas in the rest of the country where there's circles everywhere, this is really still a really sparsely birded region in terms of the Christmas bird count. So finally, I come around to my pitch to get everybody involved. So I think these counts are a lot of fun, but also they contribute data to the longest running community science project in the country. 100 years is a pretty long time. That's older than just about all of us, I guess. And it's really low stress birding. You know, I've done some counts out on the coast where you have to identify 75 different species of gulls, and you're trying to sort out Western versus Clark's grebes that are floating on the water. And meanwhile, there's some sparrows chipping in the brush. It's hard work. Out in the Great Basin, normally you only are seeing a few birds at a time, and you can take your time to identify them. So it's a lot lower stress than those counts, and you can really enjoy yourself. And really an interesting part is just coming to understand bird survival strategies in harsh winter conditions. You start to see where they go depending on the snow conditions, depending on the water conditions, how they vacate entire regions when there's no juniper berries, and show up in other areas in big numbers. And if you like juncos, there's nothing like the Great Basin for junco diversity, with four different subspecies at least. If you count Cassiar as another subspecies, which I tend not to, that could count as 5. But slate colored is regular. Oregon junco shows up regularly, and gray-headed and pink-sided have both been recorded in recent years. So if you like juncos, it's hard to top that. And there's breathtaking scenery almost everywhere you turn around. That the Great Basin, especially the basin and range topography, these big fault blocks, big snow-covered peaks, and desert in between, is pretty amazing stuff. You won't get rained on. You might get snowed on, but hardly ever rained on. And a few counts even have free lodging, especially the more remote counts on some of the refuges. Heart Mountain and Sheldon both have graciously made their bunkhouses available for volunteers. So you can go there, spend the night before the count, go out, do the count, come back to the bunkhouse, get warmed up, have the countdown without having to drive anywhere afterwards, and just enjoy your time there. And finally, no matter where you go on these bird counts, you're always going to run into a few surprises. I cheated here. This northern cardinal, it's not really a real northern cardinal. I was on the upper Nestucca count. This is another harsh count in the Oregon Coast Range. But I was walking along and found this plastic northern cardinal probably 2 miles from the nearest road that somebody left up there while camping in the summer, apparently. So you never know what you'll find. So with that, I'd like to see if there's any questions. And I'll try to put my video back on and see if my feed works.
Great. Thank you so much. That was very, very interesting, Joel. We've got one hand raised. Linda, I will allow you to talk if you would like to speak your question. Linda, you are muted if you would like to ask your question. Or perhaps that was an accidental hand.
Anyway, hi, Linda. Linda's been one of the volunteers on the Heart Mountain and Sheldon counts and Winnemucca, I think, recently. Probably others.
Well, since she is not speaking up, we have Judy Meredith with a hand as well, and I will unmute you. Oh, well, you are. Oh, there you go.
Okay, so I think most of these counts are underrepresented in terms of enough volunteers, but those that are within 1 or 2 days from, say, Central Oregon, which ones are most in need of more help?
Yeah, I think the for Central Oregon, really the Heart Mountain is probably the toughest one to staff. And Sheldon, in Sheldon we do pick up a few people coming from Reno, so that gives us another source of volunteers. And I know for Central Oregon, people driving all the way back is a hard one. Summer Lake usually is pretty well staffed. And it's also possible to go by that one on the way to Heart Mountain. And as you know, you can get lunch there. It's unique tradition. They actually stop birding at noon. Everybody comes back to the headquarters for lunch. And I think Malheur is often short also. Malheur and Burns counts. Those would be the main ones.
Okay.
And Adel was back when we used to run it. That was a hard one also.
I remember doing that one. I think there were 5 of us.
Yeah, I think I did it with 2 people once, me and Matria. So,
Oh.
but we were getting snowed on. We had to flee.
Okay, well, I would be willing to try to drum up more people, especially if you can do like you did last year and some years where they're kind of scheduled in a string, so you can go from account to account to account.
Yeah, that's something that has worked really well in the northern part of the basin. We with the Summer Lake count happening, that has a set date usually. Well, I think we got them to Marty to change it by 1 day last year, but then we were able to do the Heart Mountain count the next night. So from Summer Lake, it's a fairly easy drive to Heart Mountain. Everybody gets to the bunkhouse before sundown usually, and then spend 2 nights there, then move to Sheldon, 2 more nights there. And some people actually went off. Well, they were going to go off to the Malheur counts. There's also the chance to split off because Rick Vetter runs those on roughly the same time. So you can sort of help either one of those from there. And then after the Sheldon count, a few of us went down and helped on the Winnemucca count. And that was scheduled the day after the Sheldon count. So yeah, that really worked well for getting more volunteers to actually all of those counts. Only the problem was that Heart Mountain got snowed out. We couldn't even get up there. So we had to run that later, and we rescheduled it for the late in the season.
Thank you.
But yeah, ideas like that are always great. Yeah, thanks. By the way, thanks, Judy. You've been a big part of getting people to show up for counts too, I know.
Well, I'll just say one more thing, and that is that if we can figure out dates earlier on, I have tried to get people, like we set Madras for the first Wednesday and yada, yada, things like that. And then if other counts happen, we don't have enough people for Madras, not enough people for Ty Valley, not enough people for, a lot of those. So it gets kind of hard to leave a local one and go to the Great Basin. But if we could schedule them, I think you get more people.
Yeah. Yeah, working on a schedule that works for everybody. Sorry, I just accidentally loaded it wrong up. Yeah, working on a schedule that works for everybody gets hard as the region stretches out, because we have going from, sort of from, I guess, Ty Valley all the way down to Reno. There's always going to be some conflicts, but as long as some people are able to peel off, because it doesn't take that many, as you know, it doesn't take that many people to make these counts work, where
Right.
some of the counts in more bird dense areas really do take more participants.
Thank you.
Well, I don't see any more questions, but I was thinking about this sort of while I was watching your slides, sort of the value in reviving some of these old counts versus filling in some of the gaps you were talking about, and maybe creating new circles, and was interested to hear your perspective on some of that, and where effort is best spent and what has the most value to the CBC data set.
Yeah, to me, it's always good if you can restart a count that's covering an area that isn't really covered. I'm not sure, but the Unionville count would be interesting, and it's probably not that hard to get to from Reno, especially if someone's on their way home from Winnemucca or going to Rye Patch to check it out. The one interesting, I really think Austin would be a really interesting place to have a count. I know it's high elevation, but it does have usually reasonable winter access, and it really gets you into the heart of the pinyon pine belt in that part of Nevada. So that it would probably be one that would require some people that want to do some trekking, maybe a little bit of snowshoeing, but at least you could start from the town and work out from there. And the Walker Lake count could also be interesting. And then Tonopah, which I don't know, you mentioned the solar plant, and I guess I don't know what your thoughts would be on that. I haven't birded around Tonopah that much in the winter, but I remember John Brack used to get interesting, especially rosy finches showing up out of nowhere in town there.
Yeah, Tonopah in the winter is another high elevation place. Town is over 6,000 feet. It's great migrant traps around there, and migration. Tends to be pretty quiet from my experience birding Tonopah in the winter months.
Yeah.
Yeah, even sort of the ornamental trees and subsidies in people's lawns are pretty sparse around there.
Yeah, and another factor is some areas people might not want to bird that much. I mean, if it's an area that's already been hammered by a lot of mining operations, that's why I thought Eureka has a little bit more. Public access is kind of a big thing too. Being in a place where you can actually get out on the land, even if a lot of BLM land is theoretically accessible, it might not always be, but certainly national forest lands are usually available.
Well, we certainly have that going for us here in Nevada.
Yeah. Yeah. Was it 95% of the state is public land?
Yeah, maybe not quite that much, but yes, certainly a very high percentage.
Yeah. But yeah, I think Austin to me was that's the one that really jumps out at me. And then the other one, Walker Lake, that count circle wasn't really located at the lake, and I'm not sure how productive that lake is in winter. I'm not sure if it gets much birding activity, but
yeah, that lake is kind of a sad story. It seems to be less and less productive as the years go by.
Yeah, I've heard. I think that was one that got designated as one of the terminal lakes in Harry Reid's bill a few years ago, and which had all the connotations of that term terminal built into it.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess the other thing, if in terms of starting new counts, if someone gets interested, Audubon does like to see some promise that the count's going to last for a few years, and usually they ask you to show that you can get 20 volunteers out there each year. But I think in this region they can be talked into counts that have fewer birders. Down to 10 often works. I mean, even for example at Sheldon, we often run out of real habitat to bird by the end of the day because all the birds are concentrated pretty much in the wetlands and along a few streams. And if you want to spend, in fact, we did spend one time 2 hours birding in total desolation and had one golden eagle to show for it, a couple of canyon wrens a little farther down the canyon. So that can be, I think, the bar for starting a circle, just to get more data out in some of these points and get birders out there, could be lower.
Yeah, I think Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like you'd be hard pressed to get 20 volunteers for any of these Nevada or Great Basin remote circles in any
Yeah,
year. But I
yeah,
think having it near some sort of, the Ruby Lake one being at the wildlife refuge with the agency able to sponsor it, that helps it a lot. So I think in more rural, remote areas, having it near something like that is pretty helpful for its continued existence.
yeah. Having some lodging options is kind of real important too, because especially if you in winter conditions, you don't
Yeah,
want to be driving
you'd
at
have a
night.
hard time convincing anyone to go camp out in Sheldon in the winter.
Yeah, well, there's one guy, Jake Shass, who has helped us. Actually, at Heart Mountain, he's camped out in his car, but he's a guy that works in Antarctica for fun. So, um, yeah, well, there's something else I was going to mention about. Yeah, I slipped my mind already. But yeah,
Okay.
yeah. If anyone does get interested in starting a new count, also I'm or restarting an old one, I'm happy to help out and help with lobbying for it with National Audubon and also just getting a feel for how to run the count. Oh yeah, I was going to say Winnemucca. Roy Morris was delighted last year when I think he had 6 volunteers show up. So that was an all-time record for Winnemucca. So
Yep. I think even when I did the Fallon count, there was less than 10 of us. So
yeah. But the nice thing about small groups is that you get to meet everybody, and also there's usually if someone finds some good birds, then that can be communicated and they can go look at it. If you're working on a big count, you have to work all the way until 4 p.m. and later on you find out about the bird that no one can find the next day. So
well, my last question is when are we gonna get a snowy owl in Nevada and where is it gonna show up, Joel?
oh, I thought, isn't there a record of one that showed up in Las Vegas?
There is. It's in a
Yeah.
museum somewhere. It was collected in the God, I want to say the 20s. I want to say 1929 is the collection date on that. But yeah, that's Nevada's only snowy owl record from Indian Springs down there. Clark
Yeah,
County.
I've tried to count. There's a rock at Continental Lake between Sheldon and Denio that I've tried to count as a snowy owl several times, but it's not in the count circle. So even if I misidentified it, it wouldn't be.
Yep. Always the hope.
Yeah.
Well, I don't see any more questions in there, so I'll give folks another couple seconds if they've got anything else on their minds. But I want to thank you again, Joel, for that great presentation. That was very interesting and very relevant. And community science is sort of an up and coming trend in data collection, and it has a lot of value. And I'd love to continue to see these counts grow and get more and more participation. Maybe bring back some of those extinct counts.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, appreciate it. And yeah, also if anyone thinks of a question later, hopefully my email is out there somewhere. And that's a
Yeah,
good way to
actually,
get a
would
hold
you
of me.
mind typing that into the chat box here
Yeah, I can do
in
that.
the
Yeah.
webinar so folks could reach out if they were interested? That would be great.
Yeah. And so email is, well, I have 2 emails. The one I send out is just Clearwater, or if that's hard to remember, it also works to just send to like my name, joel.geier@peak.org. So, and Peak is our little local internet service that managed to somehow handle my bandwidth here. So,
Great.
so yeah, there it is.
Lovely. All right. Well, thank you so much, Joel, and everyone else. You can see Joel's contact info in the chat if you are interested. And I did not mention at the beginning, but this this webinar was recorded and it will be posted to the Great Basin Bird Observatory YouTube channel as soon as I get to editing and posting that. So that'll likely be tomorrow. So
Awesome.
Thanks everyone for coming. And thank you again, Joel, for presenting. And we will see you all next time.
All right. Have a good night, and everybody. I hope we get some cool weather soon.
Yeah, same to you.
Uh-oh.